多分。はい。大丈夫そうかな。大丈夫。
はい、お願いします。
はい。すいません。ありがとうございます。で、なんか、大丈夫？OK です。じゃあ、自分の方から、OA をして、ディベーターの方、それが終わったら、コンペティティブジャッジにフィードバックしてっていう流れになります。OA は、2個目だと思うんで、短めにやります。はい。まあちょっと、一瞬じゃやこめをして、こう言って、OA します。in terms of general feedback, which is really a quick one, which is motion sets that this motion is about whether this escalating tension does or will do more harm than good for countries around South China Sea, which means that all of the arguments in the motion in the round should be explicitly linked to the whether it is does harm or benefit to the countries around South China Sea. So I think it is easy for teams to claim that US does something, China does something, but note that all of these analysis should be linked as a bottom line as the whether it is a harm or benefit for these countries around South China Sea. Yeah, and then I'll just give you the ranking and then read through the justification. The call is as follows. I gave first to opening Guff, second to closing Guff, and third to closing up, and fourth to opening objection. I repeat the call. OG first, CG second, CO third, and OO fourth. And I think first is clear, and I think up bench was relatively tight in my opinion. Let's go on from top half and bring each closing teams. I'd like to firstly explain why I thought opening Guff beats opening opposition. The major reasons that I want to flag in the top of the justification is that, as I highlighted in my general feedback, I think opening opposition case has relatively weaker linkage with the harms and benefit of countries around South China Sea, whereas OG's case explicitly able to build this link in their cases. I like to mainly talk about two things, but before that, I like to just quickly summarize what we get from either both OG and OO. From OG, we got a few core ideas. Firstly, in terms of why this military expansion of China, and mainly likely to be materialized in the form of invasion of Taiwan, will ultimately harms the security of the South China Sea region. In the form of invasion harms lots of people in Taiwan, of course, and even if invasion does not happen, there is a series of harms that countries around South China Sea will face, such as increased territorial disputes around South China Sea and region in response to Chinese militarization, and there's lots of small-scale conflicts that more frequently happens in that region. Second thing we got from OG is that China will get high level of isolation due to a Trump policy to isolate China from this trade bloc, which mainly dealing with semiconductor and GPU or whatever that technology thing, and this also convinced China to approach the South China Sea region for the sake of natural resources for the trade deal, and this also gives threat to these regions as a whole. As opposed to that, what we get from opening opposition is firstly that China will be less aggressive due to this tension because they're afraid of the US retaliation. So it is unlikely that China have strong incentive to actually invade Taiwan, or due to this risk of retaliation, the likely scenario that China will face is that they will just tone down their level of aggression against this region, against US. Thereby, this also means that there is going to be less aggression in South China Sea region as a whole. then the first thing that I want to talk about is that about the main logic of opening opposition, which is the risk of U.S. retaliation will tone down the degree of Chinese aggression in South China Sea. And I thought in the end this logic was not proven well. And I think the most evident missing link on this logic is that although proves that there are risks of U.S. retaliation against China, but I don't think there are very little mechanization to prove why those risks are perceived to be critical one to China, which is enough to tone down their level of aggression in the end. Although this logic coming from opening opposition and the responses that we got from opening opposition was fair enough to mitigate the plausibility of the opening government's best case scenario, which is Taiwan invasion, but this does not take out the majority of the OG case, which is about the necessity of militarization in China will worsen the security in South China Sea. And I think more, which end up being that having more small scale but harmful conflict happens in this region. And I think opening opposition responses does not tackle this claim in the end, since firstly, I think empirical evidences from Venezuela or Iraq, etc., does not give the silver bread for opening opposition to say that China is all the same situation around these countries. And secondly, I think proving that emergence of the urgent necessity to militarize is enough, unlike proving the actual invasion happening. And I think opening government claim that a lot of opening government remaining material of that increasing tensions and geopolitical tension among US and China will ended up being materializing in the form of more smaller but frequent conflict tension in South China Sea due to the response to the militarization that China does. Second thing that I want to touch here is about the economy and semiconductor issue, and I think this issue gives a slight credit to the opening government as well. And I think at least this argument or this analysis coming from OG suggests that and contributed to the proof of why China will face more necessity to militarize and acquire higher geopolitical ground over other Asian countries to maintain their economy and maintain their military competence. I think we got series of responses from the opening opposition, and I think it was fair to say that China isn't likely to acquire a self-sufficient supply of semiconductor. But I don't think this analysis tackles the actual intention of this argument per se, which is to say, it is true that China isn't super likely to maintain or acquire the self-sufficient supply of semiconductor or any other high level of technology. But that's the precise reason why opening government claim that because China has a higher level of difficulty due to this escalating tension with US, and they cannot, they're almost impossible to maintain the self-sufficient supply of the, semiconductor. That's the precise reason why they have more necessity to militarize and acquire a harder power to pressurize other countries or South China Sea issues, and to maintain their trade route or the trade deal with the other countries. And that's also leads to a substantial threat to the South China Sea countries. Although I don't think this was that explicitly proven by opening gov, but I think still this is a portion of analysis that opening government succeeded to add on this mechanism. Okay, that's why OG beats O. I'd like to move on to closing gov. The major addition that we got from closing government is mainly about economy, and the reason why this escalating tension between US and China will eventually harm the trade and economy of Southeast Asia countries. And I think main logic we got from CG is that Southeast Asian countries depends on both China and US. And I think some countries are not like this, but I think they claim that majority of countries are bilaterally dependent on both countries. So in case of escalating tension, they either needs to pick a side or they need to get involved in this trouble or increasing geopolitical tension in South China Sea. This will not only geographically, it will be difficult to ship goods to Southeast Asian countries from China or from US, but it also politically, these countries will face far more difficulty on maintaining a trade deal just like a status quo, or just like the way it used to be. Thereby, this harms the economy of Southeast Asian countries. In terms of government, I think in the end, I don't think closing government materials was a meaningful addition to the opening government case, because CG had an additional impacting on why tension is bad, because the byproduct of this tension is bad economy. But I think there's few questions right can be asked to this material coming from CG. Things like why the countries have ties with US, for instance, get more harm due to they have less connection with China, or how much of the opportunity cost will be lost due to this increasing tension. And I think there are larger analytical gap compared to opening government material to prove that how much of trade deal or how much of economical harm will be imposed due to this escalating tension of two superpower. So I think just, in terms of contribution, I don't think CG's material is sufficient to beat opening government. In terms of short cross, I think as opening opposition also noted and agreed, China is dependent on other countries, especially in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asian countries also have connection with US. And I think this situation, regarding this characterization and contextualization, closing government did have some proof on suggesting that regional tensions that take place in South China Sea does definitely have trouble, increase a confusion or increase a complication dealing, in terms of trade deal or in terms of shipping of goods or whatever the logistical issues that this trade happens in this region. I don't, as I highlighted earlier, I don't think closing government explicitly prove that to what extent that this harms the economy of each countries. But what CG suggests that this is unique change in terms of when tension escalates, the degree of harm of that this trade difficulty for the Southeast Asian that heavily dependent on the superpower in terms of domestic economy, these countries would get a substantial degree of harm. As opposed to that, I don't think opening objections analysis that why this risk of retaliation will be perceived enough critical enough by China to tone down this aggression against this region was not sufficiently proven by compared to this analysis. That's why CG takes over OO. Last reveal. We got few interesting idea from closing opposition. Mainly this is to suggest that maintaining a military operation or even an invasion to Taiwan cost a lot of money from China, and that's the precise reason why that that China's isn't likely to be able to just maintain this operation or conduct this operation to begin with. The main logic that we got from closing opposition is that why multinational companies that locate their branches in China will likely to pull out these branches or factories or any businesses from China due to this escalating tension with US. I think the logic, the actual mechanism was quite simple, as these companies are quite risk averse. They don't want to get involved in the conflict. China might forcibly just pull out human resources out of these factories, and I think there's many reasons as to why multinational companies isn't likely to like this situation, thereby they pull out. In terms of bench, I think at least closing opposition explicitly challenges the core logic of the opening government, which was insufficiently done by opening opposition. And I think the problem of opening opposition is that although their critique against opening government was about OG never proves the incentive of China, but also opening opposition cases lacks the sufficient incentive analysis of why China will tone down these aggression, or why China will convinced enough to just tone down this behavior that they are doing currently. I think closing opposition's challenge against opening government in this sense was more of a meaningful addition compared to opening opposition, since the CO fights on the ground of capacity of China, the domestic capacity of China that conduct that the conduct the scale of the military operation is likely to be relatively lesser. And I think this analysis of examining that why China likely to have less and less capacity in the future was more meaningful addition in terms of the challenge against gut bench. But I think there is a series of questions that I need to address on closing opposition in regards of comparison with gut bench. First thing is that I don't think closing opposition link this analysis as to suggest why does this mean that this does more benefit than harm to these countries just because these China have less capacity of invading Taiwan. Maybe it is a benefit for Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan is a scope of this motion, and I think closing opposition did have a plenty of weighing to suggest why Taiwan is really important actor, and I do agree with that. But I don't think this framing really matters in this debate as long as other especially governments also talk about equally important stakeholder that which motion requires you to argue, which is a countries around South China Sea. So I think the first missing link of the closing opposition material is that although they are able to prove that China might have less capacity, but I don't think this was linked to how much benefit that this brings to these South China Sea countries. And second, and more critical thing is that although I get the core logic of closing opposition, but I don't think they prove that how much of these multinational companies that the revenue that they produces has been and will be contributing to the Chinese national budget of military, or this financial how much that China depend on multinational companies in terms of their military budget. I think although because closing opposition's core logic is that national spending on military is very high when it comes to higher tension. That's why MNC leaving from China is damaging to China. But I don't think there is a explicit linkage built between these two logic, and I don't think closing opposition explicitly proved the actual likelihood that the larger likelihood of the larger degree of economic harm will be caused to the China in domestic sense. Lastly, on bottom half, but I think regarding all of that, I don't think closing opposition beats opening gulf. And lastly, on CEO, CG, I think CG's analysis is contingent on the escalating tension itself, which comes slightly ahead of closing opposition's claim, which is contingent on multinational companies leaving China as a byproduct of this escalating tension happens, which requires a little bit of higher degree of burdens of how many companies will leave or how much damages that this inflicts on China, as I highlighted earlier. And I think closing government analysis on this tension in itself will substantially increases the risk of maintaining the trade or risk of losing a trade partner or losing a stable supply of the critical goods from China or US. And I think this degree of harm that the closing government suggests was more compelling and well made compared to closing opposition. That's all for my OA. Sorry for a bit taking long. 自分のOAは